And okay, it looks like this Hangout on Air is now live. Welcome, everybody. Um, this is the Biblical Scholars Google Hangout on Air for the course OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015. And you can see that course at ootle.net, OOTLE.net. And this week we're going to be talking about the wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible. And we have with us today a healthy bullpen. We've got Brian Bibb and David Garber and Nisha Jr. and Sarah Koenig. Let's go real quick, and why don't each of you, if you don't mind, just tell us which of you are who and what you teach and where you teach it. How does that sound? Good. How about Brian? Why don't you go ahead first?
Okay, my name is Brian Bibb, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You sound
Okay,
good.
I got a new mic, so I didn't know if it was working. I teach at Furman University in South Carolina. It's a liberal arts undergraduate university. I've been here for 15 years, and my research these days is on the politics of English Bible translation.
All right, and David?
Hey, I'm Dave Garber, and I'm from the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. I've been teaching there for 10 years, teach Old Testament and Hebrew, and I'm currently working on projects related to social justice in the Hebrew Bible.
All right, and how about Nisha?
Hi, I'm Nisha Jr. I teach Hebrew Bible at Howard University School of Divinity, and I'm on Twitter at Nisha Jr.
And Sarah?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm Sarah Koenig, and I teach at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, obviously. And I've been here for 12 years, and I teach a lot of the Intro to the Bible class, as well as Hebrew and Old Testament Upper Division classes. And my research is currently on the reception history of Bathsheba.
All right. And I'm Brooke Lester. I teach at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Currently working on, actually not even currently, pretty much all the time working on allusion in the Bible or interbiblical interpretation. I was trying to, for one thing, I was reflecting that we have decided to hold these Google Hangouts at what we would normally call the worst possible time to hold a seminar of any kind, the late afternoon time. So by rights, what we ought to be doing is sitting around a table that has lots of snacks and caffeine on it. So in that sense, we're doing it wrong, unless you all have, like, brownies and Pop-Tarts tucked away that I can't see. There we go.
And traditionally, there should be salty snacks, sweet snacks, caffeinated beverages, and uncaffeinated.
There's a canon. To the to the snacks, as everyone knows who's had the late afternoon seminar.
Well, canon is determined by community, so if we're talking about the Emory community, we would have moon pies in John Hayes' seminars. That was the traditional snack.
That sounds really good.
They're really not.
They're really not. They sound really good. Okay, and I was trying to figure out, because I know I've talked with Sarah recently, and was reminded that I'm on semesters and Sarah, you're on quarters, and so we're living in a different time right now with regard to our courses. This for us is the third week of class, so things aren't exactly still fresh and new, where all things are possible, but the bloom isn't completely off the rose on the spring semester yet. There's still that kind of optimism in the air that all things are possible to a certain extent. We haven't yet run up against what in the fall I would call October surprise, and what in spring I call the Ides of March, which is that day when you walk into the classroom and you realize that this is the day when they stop even pretending to laugh at your jokes. Or pretending not to just be tired. But so where are you, Sarah? You're in the quarters, so you're what, at the midpoint?
No, we're week 7, but it's that, not just midpoint, but we've gone a ways and we still have a couple weeks left to go. So if any of you run or something like that, it's like you don't see the finish line quite yet, but you're still really tired from everything that you've done so far. And then a couple weeks ago, we in Seattle were particularly sad after the Super Bowl loss. So it was like the no joy in Mudville thing, where not only were students tired but just sad for a good week or so. So yeah, we've been in the blues for a while here.
Yeah. How about anyone else? Where are you at in your terms, if you care?
Well, we just had a snow day, so we are already behind, unfortunately. But we'll probably skip something in wisdom literature so that I can get to the midterm and then move to prophets.
Skip the Proverbs. I don't think anybody really needs the Proverbs. I would just skip past those.
We did a little bit. It'll be enough.
You have to have something to deconstruct.
That's true. That's true. What are you going to push against with Job and Ecclesiastes if you don't give them just a little bit of Proverbs? So, how about Dave and Brian? Where are you all at?
I'm about a month into our semester, 6 weeks in, maybe something like that. So, yeah.
We're at about the same place. We just had a snow day, but it was on a Tuesday, which I don't normally teach anyway.
Okay.
So
that's always how it is.
So that's, I don't know, it's not entirely satisfactory snow day.
Snow days are the worst, and we have a cold day today. All the elementary schools and middle schools, and I think the high school are out because of a cold day today in the Chicago area. And I was trying to decide whether snow days and cold days are an argument for or against online learning. Because when we have snow days and cold days, on the one hand, our schedule's not disrupted, because it doesn't really change anything about our schedule. On the other hand, we don't get a snow day. We don't get a cold day. So, yeah.
Well, let me say how it's helped me. When teaching online, kind of gives me some perspective on different activities that they could do. So if a snow day comes along, I can send them to do something that will kind of make up the contact time that the accreditation societies are so intent on keeping records of. So online teaching has at least helped me do that, or if I know we need a break, I can do it that way. So
that's good. I was we're doing wisdom in this hangout this time, and that shows you where I'm at. It occurred to me that normally I write something up for my students explaining why we're going through the course, starting with the writings. When I teach it, and I realized that I haven't written that up for my students yet. It's been on my list of things to do. I like to get them started in it and then sort of unveil what I'm doing there. Although it's really easily stated that, one, you get that nice thing of having biblical texts that disagree with one another. I think that's come up in a previous hangout. And also, you don't have to know the whole gosh darn history, timeline, and geography of the history of Israel like you do to try to make sense of JEDP, But that is why we're doing wisdom at this point. And I was going through that thing when I was setting up the weeks for the writings and this week for wisdom. And I don't know if any of you ever had this where I'm starting to feel how I'm stuck in my rut on wisdom. You know what I mean? Anything that you teach over and over again, especially true for introductory courses, where I've got the hatful of things that I always want to say about the wisdom literature. A lot of it has to do with being really excited about the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. Some specific things about the book of Job, especially the way that he really cuts loose and I would argue just flat out blasphemes, against God versus the popular image. So I've got my hatful of things, but I was doing that thing where I dismissed the Proverbs again. Proverbs. They all sound the same, and they're all annoying, and they're all fit only for like 6-year-olds. And I kind of caught myself short when I was preparing for this one, and I was like, am I not giving the Proverbs a chance? Do I need to go back to the introductory textbooks and reread on the Proverbs and try to get excited about them? And I did a little bit. I found some things to get excited about the Proverbs, but I wanted to ask you all: Are any of you excited about the Proverbs? And if so, help me. If you're excited about the Proverbs, and tell me why. You tell Nisha and I why you're excited about the Proverbs.
I can't say that I'm excited about the Proverbs, but there are some quirky ones in there that I can toss in just for some shock value every now and then. But one thing that kind of helped me in thinking about the Proverbs is some of the writings of Tim Sandoval, who suggests that we sometimes too often draw a strict dichotomy between Proverbs and Job in Ecclesiastes, and that there is some more introspective Proverbs, especially towards the later chapters and the writings of Agur and all those, that might be worth looking at and thinking about the construction of the book as a whole.
I would also say I'm not excited about the Proverbs. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm not excited about the Proverbs, but I do think I read someone who said the Proverbs are like snapshots, individual pictures that you have taken through your life. And you think of something like your Facebook page or any sort of social media where you're posting pictures of yourself. And a given picture isn't going to capture the entire aspect of who you are, but you can pull out one, and this can say, oh, this is me on vacation. And you can pull out another one and say, oh, this is me when I'm somewhere else. And so Proverbs are more like that, where you can pull out a single one and it could fit for a particular situation, but the problem is when people apply that single proverb to be sort of a blanket for describing all of life and all of how you should live. But if you can see the collection more in that way, I thought that was a helpful metaphor for it.
Yeah, I agree. And there's my favorite example of the kind of complexity, hiding in the simplicity of the Proverbs that both of you talk about. And maybe someone can help me cite it. I always thought it was in chapter 8, but I don't think it is. I think I looked and it wasn't there. Is the where you have the one proverb that says something like, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly." Why should you? Sort of like, don't try to teach a pig to whistle or something like that. And then the very next proverb says, "Answer a fool according to his folly. Why should you let him get away, with nonsense?" And having those come one right after the other in that way, especially in this material that is kind of, I've been using the Christopher Stanley textbook for a couple years, and he talks kind of nicely about, Proverbs make sense for school teaching because when we're teaching our children to behave, we don't say, okay, little Susie, sometimes it's okay to lie because there's larger, factors at play. And so we just say, no, we tell the truth, and we don't tell lies, and we keep it simple. But even in that simplicity, you've got that kind of acknowledged complexity by putting the two side by side. Answer a fool according to his folly and do not answer a fool according to his folly. It reminds me of sort of like in the New Testament, the parables of Jesus where, 1 second, Jesus is running around saying, if anyone wants to follow me, if you even turn back, to put your hand to the plow, forget about it. You've hesitated too long. And then he turns around 2 seconds later and says, if you're going to be a disciple, count the cost. Count the cost of discipleship. It's like, well, which is it, Jesus? People talk about that, right? That it's both. That these things depend on circumstances, and that the Proverbs are assuming that you're going to be contextual, yeah. I guess in your reading of the Proverbs.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones to cite as well. Proverbs, it's 26:4 and 5.
Okay.
And do not answer fools according to their folly, or you will be a fool yourself. Answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes. So. I usually use that in introducing antithetical parallelism, but also that concept of wisdom is not knowing the proverb, when wisdom is about kind of knowing when to use the proverb or when to use it. Kind of when I don't like the word apply because it feels like a Band-Aid then, but to kind of put it into action.
I actually wrote up a little piece on my blog when Brian and I were having a conversation about Proverbs. And I talked about how I have my class read, I think it's Proverbs 1 through 9, and also read alongside that, Jamaica Kincaid has a short sort of story about a girl who's growing up in a Caribbean island, and we talk about issues of context as both sets of text provide instruction to the young on how to behave. And so reading the two together helps the students to see the importance of context in reading these proverbs and not simply trying to, quote unquote, apply them to our lives.
It's really hard, though. I mean, for like the proverbs don't really seem to tell you that. You know what I mean? They look very they just look divorced from context. They just look like they're not really introducing that to you, which I guess makes sense. I mean, if you pulled my course materials out of context, you know, and just bound them together, that they wouldn't really represent what I had in mind or what was actually happening in my teaching context. So you'd think we, you know, like it's just recognizing that is something that you really need someone to tell you, you know.
And that's why reading Proverbs in concert with another text that's in some way similar helps the students to see that, because I think there usually is this notion that these texts are not only easy to apply, but are appropriate to apply to our contemporary lives.
I like to go back and look at the definition of proverb, or the Hebrew term mashal, because it seems that in some instances mashal is used as that kind of proverbial saying. But it's also used in terms of riddles, and sometimes I read the book of Proverbs that way. In fact, I was just looking it up here. Riddle, parable, proverbial saying are all kind of within that context of that meaning. And so, you know, in your comment, Brooke, about comparing it to the parables of Christ, I think is kind of appropriate in that sense, that it's not about memorizing something so that it can be applied, but also knowing context and analyzing context, like Nisha said, to figure out what is the wise thing to do in a certain situation.
I compare it to river rafting, where if you're rafting, you have to think about where you are in the river and what direction you need to be pointed. And sometimes that's not straight, right? It just depends on what's happening in the water. And you have to know which stroke to apply at a particular point, and you also have to keep forward momentum. And so I think when you think about applying particular proverbs to life, it has that kind of ad hoc, okay, what do I need now? What's going to help me at this point? And what helped before might not help now, but what is going to give me the forward momentum I need to get over this next rock, or over this next fall, or around this next bend without going into the trees or whatever. Does that make sense?
I like that, and then you can push that metaphor maybe way further than you want to take it, Brian, but to say things like, maybe there's certain things that you've done multiple times when you're river rafting, so you can return to those things again, and you know, okay, if I encounter these rocks or this sort of white water, I can pull out this particular way of responding. And so maybe there's some proverbs that we return to again in that same way, that, yeah, I'm used to doing it this way.
When we go up to North Carolina, we would take incoming freshmen for an outdoor experience, and one of the things the guides tell the students in the orientation is, stay away from rocks that have names, because they're never named things like butterfly and fluffy. You know, it's always Jaws, Widowmaker, things like that. So if it has a name, you stay away from it, right? I mean, to me, that there are sort of anchor points within the Proverbs that function like that, where it's like, no, life is changing, but here's this little bit of wisdom to keep in the back of your head. It's not always going to necessarily be the forefront, and there are times in which you might need to forge ahead because, well, maybe you're heading toward that rock and there's no avoiding it. It's too late. So now you need new kinds of, maybe even impromptu sorts of reasoning to get around the obstacle that you're facing. So, but that doesn't obviate the proverb itself. The fact that you might end up in a point where it doesn't help you doesn't mean that it doesn't have value.
Well, in my class, we also talk about the Proverbs and considering issues of gender, considering issues of class, and how all of the Proverbs aren't talking to you personally about your personal situation. So a lot of the Proverbs are providing kind of the sort of self-help advice we might see at the Barnes & Noble in the leadership section, or the getting your MBA kind of section, and talking through some of the issues that we see in the text that tries to provide advice, especially to this young up-and-coming male in an ancient society.
I like this. I like the way that you all talk about the Proverbs as something that provokes engagement, because that's really what's always been missing. That not always, but that's what tends to be missing for me on the Proverbs, is the idea that they provoke engagement. Leslie Aaron on Twitter was saying, when I think of Proverbs, I think of colloquial sayings that my grandma might use whenever it applies, flexible universal sayings. And I thought of two different sayings that I've heard from my mom growing up. One, I'll edit it for family-friendly viewing, is, you have to poop or get off the pot, right? And that's a saying that, like, I know what that means. Like, you have to kind of decipher it for a second, but it's really clear what it means. But then she would say things like, oh, honey, don't do that. Don't cut your nose off to spite your face. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean? And I would have to sort of engage it and be like, okay, wait a minute. Why would I cut my nose off? And why would I do it to spite my face? What would it mean to spite my face? What's being said here? And it would force me to sort of think it through. I guess the contrast that I'm thinking of in my head is the difference between Proverbs and sign acts, which, when we get into the prophets, we'll probably talk about sign acts at some point. But those are those crazy things like when Isaiah runs around naked for 3 years, or Jeremiah buries his underwear by the river, or you name your children names like, Kent State or Abu Ghraib or something like that, where you're doing something that's so outrageous that people can't help but ask you or themselves or their neighbors, like, what in the world is this person doing and what might it mean? And the Proverbs don't normally strike me that way, but I like the idea of the Proverbs striking me that way. I like the idea of Proverbs striking me in such a way that they provoke questions.
Well, another thing that I do in my class is ask students for their own Proverbs from their own wisdom traditions, whatever those may be. And when students share, one of the things that becomes clear is that the proverb doesn't always make sense to everyone else. So even if someone had assumed it was sort of a universal thing, that there's always someone who says, wait, I don't get it. Can you explain sort of what this is supposed to mean? And we also talk about the particular people who taught them the Proverbs and where. So, for example, some of the gentlemen in the class will talk about particular Proverbs that are shared at the barber shop. And that kind of special secret wisdom is not always shared in mixed company. So it helps to open a conversation about the particularities of wisdom and who we share wisdom with under what circumstances.
And Nisha, your comment about context made me think of what Brooke was saying earlier, which may be exactly the opposite of what was tweeted, that it's not necessarily a flexible universal saying, that it is much more contextual. But I think we're tempted to understand it as, oh, this applies exactly to me where I live right now. And maybe we need to have a little bit more of that critical distance from Proverbs in ways that we do from other texts more easily, I guess.
Well, where we get into trouble also is this applies to me is one thing, but the real trouble is this applies to you. You try to tell people, well, this proverb is going to clear your problem up, spit spot, not so fast.
Yeah.
That to me is the problem that really gets at the heart of where Kohelet and Job are coming from. It's like, wait a minute, you're giving me this, but this doesn't help me with my experience.
Let's do that. All right. So Brian, when you say that, I'm thinking, of course, right away of the friends in Job, right? Where you've got Job whom, right? The narrator has described as blameless. The narrator has God describing Job as blameless. And at one point in Job's complaint, Job acknowledges his awareness of his own blamelessness. So everybody agrees that Job is blameless, and you've got the friends offering. Everyone knows Job is blameless, and everyone knows what God has brought upon Job. The death of death of so much of his family, and his physical suffering, and so on, his loss. And the friends who keep saying, well, what you have to understand, Job, is proverb, Deuteronomic style wisdom, retributional theology, and so on and so on. Is that part of what you have in mind there, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, if you look through Job, one of the things, and you guys have worked on this more than I have, but one of the things that I point out to students is how often there are references to things that you have heard or things that our fathers have told us. I mean, just the whole thing he's interacting with is what he has heard. That is contrasted, of course, at the end with now my eyes have seen, right? So there's a seeing versus hearing dynamic within that book. And the tradition as a whole functions as something that we have heard. And instead of being constitutive of experience, Job says, no, my experience exists apart from that which I have heard. And that which I have heard does not describe this experience that I have. And through this experience now I see things that were not part of what I heard. So that's what I'm thinking about.
And they're both experience based. Like that is I'm back on like Proverbs. Arguably Proverbs reflect an experience, right? When the friends are saying things like, has a righteous person ever, has a righteous person ever been killed? I haven't seen it. Do the guilty go unpunished? Not in my experience. I'm paraphrasing, and I'm this might be challengeable, but I always have that sense that there is an experience there. It's just an incredibly limited experience, and it's an experience that attempts to present itself in normative, declarative, doctrine-building terms, whereas the experience of a Job or of a lament psalmist, for example, is dismissed.
Maybe I would say that they're talking about what they have heard, meaning just the tradition, and they're applying that tradition to the situation. The Proverbs themselves reflect experience, I think. But what I see in the friends of Job is people for whom the tradition has made them unable to have experience, authentic experience. So they haven't seen these things because their tradition has blinded them to the reality. Does that make sense? Like, I don't see them describing, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to think about Elihu, but I don't really see them saying, well, let me tell you about my experience. Let me tell you about life as I see it. I see them just constantly referring to the things that we've learned from our fathers, the things that we have heard. And
do you even see them as friends, though? I mean, we have this debate in class. Are they really friends of Job?
They wait for like 2 weeks, don't they? That's pretty good. That's longer than I would wait.
Is that all it takes? Just hang out at your house?
Yeah, I see. Like, so when they're silent, right? So they're silent for that long period of time, however long it is at the beginning, and there they do look like friends. People who just come and are with you, who are just with you, in your suffering, and then they start to talk.
Well, and they start to talk in response to Job's lament, where he basically says, I'm going to kill, I wish I was dead. And so there's something in that do you stay silent in the face of something like that? Because the very first response is kind of tentative, but it seems like he had to say something in response to Job's really dramatic lament there. But I think that's the pastoral example from this, that so tempted to give answers when people are asking for them, and maybe that's a temptation to just not go into, because it goes downhill so badly. So they may have good intentions, but what their actions or their words end up saying are so cruel and so heartless.
I think in answer to Nisha's question, I think they are certainly members of the community, and this ties into that pastoral thing that Sarah was talking about too. They're members of the community, so there's an assumption that they are friends. They've waited and been there in the mourning period with Job. But in studying trauma and its effects on communities, one of the things that is apparent is that trauma victims, the communities want trauma victims to stay silent, that they want to push that out of their experience. And so what we have here is a community that's being fractured because of one individual's trauma, and he's trying to express what he's experienced and lament that, but the community who has not experienced that is trying to kind of wipe it out of their minds because they don't even want to go there. That's kind of how I see it in many ways.
Because someone like Job, are you saying, Dave, is threatening, right? That if that part of what is felt to hold our world together, right, are these commitments. In this case, about the nature of God and God's ways with people, and the way that suffering and justice work in the world. And when Job, just by sitting there, I mean, or really, as y'all say, like once he starts talking is when they lose their cool. And as long as Job is the silent sufferer who just sits there and naked I came into this world, naked I shall go, blessed be the name of the Lord, as long as he just sits there and mouths the correct pieties, then everyone is sympathetic and everything is kosher, everything is okay. And as soon as he begins to blame God, as soon as he begins to build his case, right? As soon as he begins to build his case against God, then all he has are enemies. His friends are now his enemies. Really polite spoken, really mealy mouthed, enemies, because they're threatened, right? Because I'm interested in that Job represents a threat with his speech.
Well, if you think about it, the narrator sets up Job as the innocent character, and God's dialogue sets up Job as the innocent character, and so they're looking at Job as this kind of paragon of virtue, probably in the community beforehand, and then the threat is, well, wait a minute, we are orthodox, so we're kind of close to where Job is, kind of morally, ethically, and whatnot, but if this happened to Job, it could happen to us. So maybe one way we can kind of make ourselves feel better is to find out what Job actually did wrong, so that we can kind of go on with our lives and not live under the threat of this divine torture that has happened to Job.
And people get, I can't remember who I heard say something like this. I've paraphrased it a number of times as something like, when people start feeling they need to protect God or defend God, leave the room. Get as far from them as possible, because nothing's quite so dangerous as someone who believes that they need to defend God or protect God. And I hadn't thought about Job's friends in that regard before until this conversation, but now it sort of makes perfect sense to me, because Job is very outspoken in his case against God. His experience shows him that God is amoral, that God acts amorally, that God hands the blameless over to the wicked, and then he starts going for that. And this is my favorite thing about Job, because he's so out there, is when he starts calling for this umpire or referee, in chapter 9, I think in 16, and then in 19, he variously calls him like an umpire or his witness in heaven or this redeemer, and the repeated claim that, okay, so we're giving up on God now, right? It's like God has shown God's colors, and because God has acted in these ways, there's now an opening for in the God office. A God who will act like God and put one hand on Job's shoulder and put one hand on God's shoulder and rule impartially, between them. And it's just so out there, it just freaks. I guess I sympathize more with the Friends the more I read that, not because I'm really on their side, but if anyone is just going to give, these orthodox God-fearers the heebie-jeebies, it's absolutely going to be Job, with his call for, hey God, if this is all you can do, then we need someone better. Job's call for a better God. Does that make sense?
So do you think it's an either-or, Brooke, where it's is it their orthodoxy that makes them so afraid, or is it, as Dave said, that it's this fear that this could happen to me too, so I'm going to try and make sure it doesn't? Is it both, or is one more than the other?
Yeah, chicken and the egg.
One of the things that I do with my students is we look at the way the Friends respond to Job, sort of increasingly brittle and increasingly angry, and they get to the point where they finally start just making stuff up about him, trying to find the sin, you walked around here like you were the king and all these kinds of things. And the question that it raises for us seems to me that a pretty good test of a tradition is, are you willing to tell a lie about someone in order to save it? Are you willing to tell a lie about God, to tell a lie about a person in order to protect or to save your theological structure, your theological system? And if you're willing to do that, then there is some pretty deep corruption or insufficiency within that tradition.
Reminds me kind of obliquely, but of like these. There's a stock character on TV shows. In the show Alias, the Arvin Sloane character, or you take any sort of grand plan-making villain, and at some point they'll have a speech about all this. Someone will say, "Oh my gosh, how can you do all these horrible things? In pursuit of your goal?" And they'll say, "For every noble purpose, there have to be sacrifices." And of course, they're not actually making any sacrifices. They're sacrificing other people. They sacrifice their family members. They sacrifice their former friends. But they feel, right, this stock character, that there's a larger truth that justifies these betrayals. And that's what you remind me of, Brian, with the Friends there, right? That once you start, as you say, once you start betraying people, once you start betraying their experience, once you start lying about them because of some concept of a larger truth, then you've crossed something there.
Are we going to talk about the prime directive?
So say more.
The Star Trek has the notion of a prime directive that under the... Wait, why am I explaining this? I do not think that I am chief nerd in this group.
And yet you brought it up.
I'm not a Trekkie.
I'm familiar with the prime directive. I'm not a huge Trekkie, but I'm familiar with the prime directive. But tell us what it is, and then tell us why you brought it up.
Anyway, okay. So with the United Federation of Planets, they're supposed to operate by this prime directive that they don't interfere in the affairs of other worlds that are not at the same technological level. But time and time again, they end up having to do something that skirts the prime directive or violates it in some way in order to serve their purpose.
Okay, and who's violating the prime directive in Job, if anybody?
Well, this would get to the question of the notion of the protecting the tradition, and what do you do to protect the prime directive? What do you do to protect your theology? What do you do to protect your notions of who God is?
I thought you were going to say, when you said prime directive, do you know what I thought you meant? I thought you were going to ask about God breaking the prime directive by monkeying around with Job. You know, that like that God that you know it's that God would be the God and Satan dialogue, right?
Yes, that
Yeah.
works too. Of God interfering or jumping in this instance by making like this side bit and using Job as this pawn in this larger game.
There's something. Okay, see if this. I mean, if anyone wants to jump in with anything, let me know. So here's where I'm kind of following that in my head because when I was reviewing Job for today, I was interested in a part where Job, and I hadn't seen this argument because, you know, his argument against the friends, where at one point he's complaining that the friends are showing partiality to God, right? That a proper judge does not show partiality between the two people that come into court together, but insofar as his friends are acting as judges, they're showing partiality to God. And it's such a common thing in my experience in discussions with students when we come around to that idea of I guess what I would call special pleading, or it's okay if God does it, right? That is, anybody else that did the kind of human experimentation that's going on in the book of Job would be convicted of crimes and quite rightly imprisoned, probably forever. But for some, but this is God, right? And the book of Job is sort of going at that question of is it okay if God does it? I remember Nixon, right, said in his interview in the Frost Nixon interview, if the president does it, that makes it legal. And there's that same kind of argument about God. And so, for example, in the you know, you'll hear many folks will say, well, it's not really God that does it; it's the Satan, right, that does it. It's the accuser who does it. God just lets him do it. You know, and this is years after like the Nuremberg trials and everything, you know, where, you know, following orders is not you don't, you know, just because a soldier follows orders doesn't mean that the responsibility falls upon that soldier, right? There's somebody giving those orders. And in this case, God is like totally busting the prime directive, and what's more, to do unethical human experimentation. See, a room full of biblical scholars, that doesn't sound controversial, right? You know.
Before we run out of time, can I ask you guys to tell me what Job 42:6 means?
Oh my God, that's one of my favorite things.
Tell me what it means. You might need to read it. You have your Bible out. You
All
might
right,
need to read
so
it. Tell me what it means.
I want anyone else to get first crack at this before I do, because I'm like you just pull my. It's like pulling the string on a doll. When you bring it up with me, and I want to give other people a chance. So this is the part, right? So God has come along, as we all know. Job has been talking about justice and the fact that if God were to appear, he would not answer Job's questions about justice. And then God appears and does not answer Job's questions about justice, but spends like 4 chapters telling him that he is a bug, and that he's not, and a young one. He's a bug and a young'un. And big old God, you know, knows best. And then Job has this terrific little thing where he sort of imitates God. Job talks again, and is very hard to understand because he first imitates God in verse 3. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And then answers that, you know, oh, I've uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. And then he imitates God again in verse 4. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will declare to me. And he responds to that by saying, here's Brian, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, and but now my eye sees you. And here's the part that you're asking about, Brian, right? and therefore I despise. I think so. English NRSV. I despise myself and repent of dust and ashes. But then there's translations that will say something like, therefore I despise, without an object. I despise and repent of dust and ashes, which is not a phrase that we have elsewhere. So there's a lot of questions around that. Does anyone have anything they're walking around with on that verse and some of the issues around it?
Well, the reason why I ask is some translations, I just posted in the chat room, the New Living Translation says, I take back everything I said and sit in dust and ashes to show my repentance, as if he's winding back, right? It's like, no, 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 I'm taking all this back. And then this leads to an interpretation of the last paragraph of the book, which is God supposedly gives everything back to Job. And so this is where we get God tested Job. Job was patient. God rewarded his patience, which is, in my mind, the opposite of the meaning of the book. And the problem is that 42:6 doesn't really mean anything in the Hebrew, but it gets translated this way, and it, in effect, in interpretation, or maybe in reception, Sarah, it undermines, in my mind, the challenge of the book. People will use this verse to sort of maybe step back from the edge a little bit.
Are you specifically looking at this for your political work, Brian, like the politics of translation?
Well, I mean, I haven't looked at this verse in that context, but I do think it applies. I mean, when you have verses that don't make any sense or that are ambiguous, there's my 10-year-old, how do particular translations resonate with and undergird interpretations that exist before the translation work began?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, for example, if you read, it's the Jansen commentary on Job and interpretation, where he basically reads this verse and he says, I am sorry that I previously doubted my... You have to help me with this, Brooke. I can't quite remember exactly what he says, but basically he interprets this verse to mean, I realize now that I have an important voice and an important identity, and I'm not going to just consider myself to be dust and ashes any longer, which is the opposite.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, and it's part of what I love about Jansen's approach here is that the image that I recall, and I can't remember how much of this is Jansen and how much of this is Lester remembering Jansen, but that Job can be seen here as someone who is sort of talking out of the side of his mouth, that he's saying things out loud that God may hear as walking it back, but which Job's maybe secret audience, who hopefully is maybe you and me, is going to hear some defiance there. So, for example, hear and I will speak, I will question you. And Job says, I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. That is, okay, these three friends have been talking, about you, and now I see you, and holy crap, it's worse than I thought.
Right, I see you. I see who you really are. I have a better understanding now of your true character and your true nature in that sense.
And that nature and character confirms my experience, out of which I uttered my complaint. It doesn't contradict that experience.
Yeah, the translation I'm seeing is or looking in the dictionaries is reject. I reject myself. It almost seems like just a resignation more than a confession. And if you say I reject, or I decline, or I step down from this line of argumentation, and I repent concerning dust and ashes, or of dust and ashes, it's like this, I'm going to move on with life, we can agree to disagree, kind of, it seems like to me as I read it. Yeah.
Do any of you all want to jump in, though, on the, repent versus comfort? I mean, because I think it's one of those Hebrew words that we just don't have that semantic range in English. We don't usually talk of them as being as related, but could he be comforted? Or is that just my wanting to be more optimistic about Job?
I mean, the reading is there, right? I mean, with this root Naham, which has that semantic domain that you talk about, so that it is about context. And that's part of what's so vexing about these last verses of these last words of Job, is that there's so much of it that is really context dependent, and the context itself is left. I'm not one of those that just loves to find ambiguity everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. I think sometimes we applaud ambiguity where sometimes we just don't understand what's going on. But here I think so. Here I think things are left in a very delicate balance. Very much like in the kitchen. After a huge shouting match between the parents, maybe the parents and the adolescent child or whatever, and it's like maybe things aren't completely resolved, and nobody's really taking back what they've said, but we're gonna back away slowly, and leave the battlefield in that way. I do like that God says specifically that Job has spoken rightly of him. He says to the friends, you have not spoken rightly of me as my friend Job has. So whatever it is that Job has spoken rightly about in God's view, it is not that he has simply adopted the perspective of the friends, because they have not spoken rightly of God.
To me, the root of the problem is people who read chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 42 and don't read anything in between. And especially if you have a translation that has Job 42, 5, and 6 implying a kind of repentance on Job's part, then you end up with a very skewed understanding of the book. And I think the way Jansen reads the ending, which that's the best part of that commentary in my view, is he says it's like dramatic irony. At the end of the book, Job is sitting on his chair and all his friends are gathered around, and they're all thinking to themselves, wow, God must have really rewarded Job for his patience. But he has like this sort of wry smile on his face, thinking to himself, man, you guys have no idea what the truth is. Because the fact is, you can't know until you have had that experience, right? And so, it's I think it's fascinating and very, very difficult.
What you just said, Brian, I actually don't teach Job to my undergrads in the intro Bible class because I'm afraid they're just gonna turn it into and the moral of the story is repent, never say anything bad against God, and you'll be blessed. And so I haven't assigned it in the past because I'm afraid of if they just read a little bit, they're not going to get that whole rich poetic core in the middle.
You can't do it in one day. I mean, in terms when I only have one day, I don't do it. But when I can squeeze in a couple of days for it, I like to, because it is out there, and they are hearing people use Job in that way. And I think it's a book that sort of needs that kind of engagement. And it's not the kind of work that it's hard for people to just stumble into that or to do it on their own. I think in that teaching context there's a special opportunity there, but you have to really take your time and commit to it. You can't do it quick, that's for sure.
With my MDivs, when I have time, I have done Job before, but we also read the Testament of Job alongside of Job. So it really does take most of the wisdom section. But we read the Testament of Job to give voice to the wife of Job and to also just get another sense of the story. So that makes it exciting, but it's a long slog to get through all of it.
Okay, speaking of voice, I want to. The book of Ecclesiastes is not going to get much voice here because we only have a couple of minutes left, and I think that's pretty typical in the teaching of the wisdom literature because none of us know what the heck to do with the book of Ecclesiastes. But I have a colleague and a close friend who's writing a commentary on Ecclesiastes, and it's on my mind. And I'm reminded that one time that I can remember that I actually told students, read the whole book of Ecclesiastes and come to class, and we're going to talk about it for an hour. And I was bowled over because when they came in, nobody was indifferent to the book. There were a few who hadn't read it, and they were indifferent. But of those who had read it, about half of them were in love with the book of Ecclesiastes and were just dying to talk about it. And the other half were so angry at me personally for having them read the book of Ecclesiastes, and they wanted to talk about it. And they were just very angry at me about it.
I would be interested to know how that group correlated to which translation they were using, because this is a place where translation makes a huge difference in how we translate Hevel. So, what kind of concept is Hevel? That's the old meaning, the old word vanity in the King James Bible, which is picked up by all of the texts that are in that tradition, New Revised Standard and RSV and the ESV. They all say vanity. The NIV, meaninglessness. So the teacher says meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless, which again I would argue is tremendously detrimental to understanding what that book is about. Right? The translation is undermining the book. And if you look at the old NIV study Bible that I had when I was in college, I haven't seen a recent one. I don't know if it's still there, but the note for that said, Ecclesiastes gives us a picture of life without Jesus. It's a bleak, pessimistic view, and it sets us up to realize how good it is, to be in Christ. And I find that to be reckless theology. I find it to be translation malpractice. But I think if the students are coming at it thinking, this book is telling me that life is meaningless, I think that you might get that reaction. But I would, obviously, I don't think that's what the book is about.
That is a terrible risk in teaching the book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll all know, and it's worth mentioning that a traditional part of the 2,000 years of Christian teaching of contempt for Judaism has been this idea, what Kendall Sulin calls the Christian canonical narrative, where the Bible story is Genesis 1 through 3, and then Matthew 1, and continuing with the New Testament. And everything from between Genesis 4 and the end of the Hebrew Bible is the fall. That's just the fall. The whole history of God with the people of Israel is the fall, and in this view is this negative witness, right? A world without Jesus. It's a horrible way to read the Hebrew Bible, as I think all of us find opportunity to talk about from time to time. And Ecclesiastes is in a special case, right? Where that kind of interpretation, if we're not careful, and Brian, as you say, talking about you can't do Job in one day. Right, you need some time. That's a reminder that probably Ecclesiastes can't really be done in one day. Or if you are going to do Ecclesiastes, to be prepared to sort of roust out that interpretation, so that line of interpretation isn't simply happening silently in the room without ever breaking the surface and being acknowledged.
So I do Ecclesiastes in one day in my foundations class. But I probably give Job shorter shrift than Ecclesiastes. But part of that has to do with just my own relationship to the book and where I stood, back in the 90s when I was taking seminars on it, and where I stand now, just having more life experience and understanding it in a different way. And so one of the things that I try to do is posit both readings. This idea that a lot of interpreters say that Kohelet says life is meaningless and there's no possibilities, and then there are other interpreters who say that life is full of possibilities, but they're limited and arbitrary. And so posing it in those two ways helps give voice to both of those crowds in a healthy way, that we can dialogue about the book. But the other thing I've faced especially in my context with especially pastors and ministers, is the sense that this misinterpretation of Ecclesiastes makes them avoid it entirely, so that they're never going to preach on it. I've heard a couple of my pastor friends say, I'm never going to preach on the book of Ecclesiastes because it's so depressing and cynical, even though it says eat, drink, and be merry. And I think that's a symptom of what some folks in my tradition have made church out to be, which is this kind of programmatic, let's just keep things going. It all has meaning, it all has purpose, it all has value, and not allowing any dissenting voice within congregations. There's this kind of sense of our congregation has to be in consensus, and in order to move forward, and moving forward is the goal. We have to move forward on whatever issue it is, and so taking the time to step back and hear voices of dissent, hear voices of oh, maybe this isn't very meaningful, is really difficult for congregations to do, as well as just for your average reader, because they're kind of constantly moving towards a goal. And well, what if that goal is Hebel? What if it's meaningless, or if it's not, even if we don't use that translation, which I think is a bad translation, if it's a pursuit after the wind, then why am I going for it? And so finding a time to talk through that, I think, is really helpful.
I would add to that, Dave, that I think similar to Brian's question about the ending of Job, when you've got that very last verse in Ecclesiastes, it's like, well, everything's been heard, just fear God and keep his commandments, which in a way, seems to sort of undermine all the wonderful questioning that Ecclesiastes models for people to say, maybe it's not just, well, just keep the commandments and fear God and that's all. It's like, well, there's more to it than that. So I think the ending of Ecclesiastes is another one of those ones that you have to unpack a little bit and not just move toward that, but allow for the space before that conclusion.
Well, I agree with that, and I think that is it Michael Fox who suggests that Hebel has to do with contradiction, and so I read that as the final contradiction of the book, so that it is not in line with the book, but ironically it is, because it's a final contradiction.
All right.
It's a dynamic that's in the larger wisdom literature as a whole. If you think about Proverbs and Job, that same kind of tension is within Ecclesiastes. I think, it's like, here's the tradition, here is experience that challenges the tradition, but yet that tradition is still very important as a kind of counterpoint, as a kind of anchor. And we need both, right? I mean, that's what Ecclesiastes says. The one who fears God will succeed with both foolishness and wisdom. Right. I mean, I think that tension, David's exactly right, that tension is at the heart of all of this stuff.
And people work really hard to find organizing principles in the book of Ecclesiastes. None of them are the same as each other, which ought to tell us something. And I rightly or wrongly, I enjoy believing that the book of Ecclesiastes is putting that across, that thing of holding on to wisdom and foolishness at the same time. Is putting it across in the only way that one can, which is in a kind of performance art that just sort of, you read Ecclesiastes and just let it wash over you and wash over you and wash over you. The book of Ecclesiastes is not something you understand so much as something that you allow to happen to you, All right, so we're at time, so we'll go ahead and let you all go. I'm so glad we had this conversation today. I've really enjoyed it. Dave, people can find your blogging and photography, I think, at garbergeektography.com. Is that right?
Yeah. Thanks for giving a shout out.
Sure, Garber Geektography. And Brian, you blog at brianbibb.com. Is that right?
Yeah, brianbibb.com, and then I'm on Twitter at bbib.
At ebib, and that's
bbib, all B's, BBIBB.
BBIBB. And Nisha, you are at nishajunior.com, and on Twitter you are at Nisha Junior.
Yeah.
Nisha Junior. And Sarah, can people find you online, Sarah, or are you actually getting productive work done instead?
Well, I wish I could say that, but no, it's I'm very new at this, so yeah.
That's good. Good. You're well insulated.
Well, spend more time on these other people's sites. You'll get a lot more out of that.
All right. And I'm Anuma Brook, ANUMMABROOKE on Twitter, and I'm at brooklester.net. So, and again, this is for the course Open Old Testament Learning Event, OOTLE15.net. And thank you for watching now or later when it's recorded. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm gonna stop the broadcast and then we can say our goodbyes.